Good evening. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 577, December 27th, 1982. See how quickly the year went and what is still current in the news from the matters we covered last year. And I'll go into that broadcast because I forgot it. But 1 year ago tonight, the radio station was out at KLRB. There was a rain and thunderstorm, windstorm, and electricity was off on the Monterey Peninsula. This week there was another storm on the Monterey Peninsula, and our radio tower went out at KAZU-FM. So those people, the local people, will have to get this tape and subscribe. I decided not to skip 1 week when we have these storms, and we'll continue for those that get these tapes by subscription. But 1 year ago, last week, which I forgot to update for you, had to do with Gaddafi and Poland and the question, which big lie will lead to World War III? And the allegations that Ronald Reagan was itching for World War III. And this week there were articles that the shooting of the Pope by the Bulgarian is tantamount to starting World War III. And they're provoking the idea and getting in your mind the possibility that a murder or a murder attempt could trigger off World War III. Last year I was talking about the Polish crisis and Poland that has pushed since World War I, the end of World War I, to fight the Soviet Union. There was also an article in New York Times just a year ago, December 15th, 1981. Bankers fear default on huge Polish debt. 75 billion debt to the West. 450 billion million interest was due last December. The money that was poured into Poland was for strikes, unrest, and it went down the drain. It wasn't for economic development or for factories and so forth, or for trade with Poland. It was to instigate that revolution against the Soviet Union, which never took place. And then, of course, just a week ago, there was an article in the New York Times of the Vatican throwing $50 million of their money to Lech Walesa, and this time, a year later, he's been brought into the Polish authorities for economic avoidance of taxes on this huge income. We'll see the rest of that later. Also, I talked about the using of Gaddafi, or the plans for Gaddafi to kill Richard Nixon, as a hoax to make Gaddafi look like somebody that was going to come and murder the President of the United States. And the trial of Edwin Wilson, he wanted to get leniency. He did get sentenced to 15 years. I don't know whether it's to make it look tough and he'll appeal and get out. On his first of 3 trials, he's been convicted and sentenced to 15 years, and we'll do some more on that later. But one of the things he brought up at his trial was that Gaddafi was going to send a hit team to the United States to kill Ronald Reagan, that he saved Ronald Reagan's life, that he was really a good patriot. And all of this news that was built up the last year was both to get Edwin Wilson off, if it would work, and to make him look like a good guy and keep the Gaddafi story going. And a year ago, I had various headline articles just from the week of December the 8th through December the 12th on the Gaddafi story that I thought were horrendous, that just that one period. San Jose Mercury hit squad denied in Libya. They said it was produced by the CIA fantasy farm. Gaddafi said he didn't plan to hit Ronald Reagan at all. December the 8th, new plan under review to oust Gaddafi, Wall Street Journal. You notice he's still there. They haven't ousted him. December the 7th, Washington Post, the Believe It or Not show a new standard of incredibility, and this is on the so-called hit teams. Then the LA Times had a story, December the 12th, doubts expressed on the Libya hit team Fuhrer. Now, see, Edwin Wilson could see there was a hit team to prove that he wanted to save Ronald Reagan, but the news media was questioning it. Then a warning sent to Gaddafi by the president in the Washington Post. The Libya leak hurts the president. This is Mr. Kraft of the Washington Post. CIA trotters plotting to kill Reagan. This is Edwin Wilson, Frank Churchill. This was in the New York Post. President bans travel to Libya. I don't know if that's been banned. Reagan rhetoric backfires. This was in the Christian Science Monitor, just as his talk about the pipelines and the sanctions has backfired on him. And the whole program just about a year ago was on the charade of the articles of the Libyan hit team. December the 20th, Monterey Herald and Washington Post, how the Libyan hit team is spoiling Christmas parties in Washington. Another article by Jack Anderson a year ago, columnists cast doubt on the list of alleged Libyan commandos, and he didn't believe the hit squad existed, but it made headlines everywhere. All the so-called responsible journalists played it up to the hilt. Reagan defends extra security. It tells how he doesn't go out to light the Christmas tree light because of the Libyan hit squad. He stays indoors. Reagan will light the tree from indoors. There was no Libyan hit squad this year, and he didn't light the tree. Stood on a porch, and the military pressed a button. He put his finger, simulated lighting it. He couldn't even press a button to turn on the tree. It had nothing to do with Gaddafi then or now. Howard Baker said hit threat diminished. This was a UPI story in San Francisco Chronicle. Kevin Phillips, Houston Post, much to do about Gaddafi. And the question was asked in the newspaper, Libya's hit team a specter of terrorism. Another story, New York Times, a full page. Rumors of assassination teams, the tension grows. The media is so manipulative, and these are just few of the headlines. Last year I did a whole rundown of one article after the other article, questioning the veracity of the government in their story and so forth. And of course we know now that Edwin Wilson set out the story, so if he were brought home to be arrested, he would say he was working for the courts and protecting the life of Ronald Reagan. Last week before I went on the air, I mentioned that I heard a news story about Jean Peters, who allegedly was married to Howard Hughes, but it was a different story, not the Jean Peters, the actress, it turned out, but there was another woman who took the name Jean Peters, and this is interesting. Her name was Alice Hovseplan, Hovseplan, almost like houseplan, only a V. She claims that she married Howard Hughes in 1946. She met him in Philadelphia. He had her change her name to Jean Peters, and this actually wasn't the stage actress. This was another woman from New Jersey, and she said she saw Howard Hughes when she was a patient at the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. You better believe that's where she saw Howard Hughes. I'm sure it is. But this long story about Jean Peters and Howard Hughes isn't Jean Peters at all. The other Jean Peters also didn't have a marriage ceremony. There was no record of her marriage, and the divorce was a piece of paper that had no more to do with the earlier marriage than the actress. But now it seems there were two Jean Peters and aliases, one from New Jersey and Philadelphia. And the news story that I heard on CNN News about the movie set arrangement thinking it was a marriage when it was a movie set has to do with this woman and not the actress who took on the charade much later in the early 70s. This happened in 1946. Jack Anderson had one little quib in the newspaper this week. It had to do with Helene vonDamm, and it's called Freudian Slip. The Reagan administration has been widely criticized as remiss in the appointing of minority members to high offices. And a group of people asked, what is going on there? Paul Foley wrote of the White House appointments that they're making. He said in quotes, "We hope to see a lot of change in policy with the addition of Helene vonDamm as the new assistant to the president and the director of white personnel." And Jack Anderson thought they meant White House personnel. But if you've been following what I've been saying about Helene vonDamm, since she came from the Gehlen operation in Vienna to Ronald Reagan's office and to Sacramento and then to Washington, I'm sure what they meant was the director of white personnel. That reminds me of when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested after John Kennedy was murdered, and he had one press conference in the evening, and the newspaper people came to see him in the press conference, and they asked him about organization that he belonged to, and Oswald said he belongs to the Free Cuba Committee, which is the anti-Castro Cuban group that he worked with in New Orleans and Mexico and in Texas. And Jack Ruby, who was at the press conference and very well known in the police department when this alleged assassin was being interviewed, spoke up and corrected and said, "Oh no, he's with the Fair Play for Cuba." And it was Jack Ruby who made the correction and used the CIA cover, the pro-Castro group, Fair Play for Cuba. And Oswald was saying he belonged to the Free Cuba Committee, which was the CIA group, which he did belong to. So he wanted to make a change, and Jack Ruby corrected him. Well, the White House said Helene vonDamm is the new assistant to the president and director of white personnel, and somebody in the office is saying, oh no, they omitted the word house personnel. And I'm sure that she is, as we know, is interested in white personnel. There was an article about Helene vonDamm in the San Jose Mercury and in the Washington Post, There's a picture of her. The article was taken from the Washington Post, an AP story. Helene vonDamm says her computer marriage takes careful organization. You better believe that one. And it says Helene vonDamm, who was in charge of presidential personnel at the White House, commutes weekends to Flanders, New Jersey to be with her husband of 2 years, Byron Leeds, an executive with U.S. News and World Report. Well, I believe that she is of the spy agency of the highest echelon, and I have U.S. News and World Report, and I look through every report and every staff person, and I don't see the name Byron Leeds. Maybe he's there and I didn't read the tiny, tiny print, but as far as I can see, his name isn't there. Maybe one of you can pick it up, but I'm sure that that also is a cover. He's from Vienna, where he met her when she was in Vienna, and U.S. News and World Report may be the place where he is located for other espionage work, and if she goes to Vienna as ambassador, he'll be there with her. But right now, we don't know. It's an article of how she commutes back and forth to be with him on the weekends. Now, why update our Kramer versus Kramer? There's always new listeners, and many of you don't know that I'm trying to find out if the plans officer of our White House is the same Fritz Kramer that was Hitler's general through the Malmedy massacre, the Battle of the Bulge, and so forth. Kramer versus Kramer, to reduce it to a few sentences, I believe they're the same person, and I believe it's very important to keep working on this matter. Now, one of the subscribers, listeners to World Watchers, went to the library to the MOBAC and requested information about Fritz Kramer to see if they could locate anything on the Fritz Kramer that we are studying here. Either Fritz Kramer he wanted, the one that Hitler had, or the one that worked for the American Army, particularly Hitler's. And this is the answer he got back from the library system on their computer. Sorry to report that I have not been able to find any biographical or current information on Fritz Kramer, other than what you have already found. I guess he told them the sources. The one book you mentioned in your message, Whiting, W-H-I-T-I-N-G, Charles, Massacre at Malmedy, that's a book by Charles Whiting, has not been on the shelf of the libraries, I guess in this California area, for the last 2 months. So we can assume that it is missing. The only information I can find that might be helpful is a page from the book, Uncertain Judgment, and some of you may want to get that, and I'll try to locate that book. Uncertain Judgment, a bibliography of war crimes by John Lewis. It has more sources of information. The item checked, I've looked at, and they do not have anything about Fritz Kramer. Remember, this is the prisoner number 33 in the docket of the Dachau trial. One of the books, the Senate hearings on the U.S. Army, the mistreatment of German defendants, did have some testimony by Kramer, Hitler's Kramer, but only that he had heard of mistreatment but was not mistreated himself. The hearing was held in Munich in 1949. And the other, Hitler's Kramer, would be traveling. He'd have to go to Munich to testify, but he would be out of jail and working in our Pentagon by 1948 if they are the same person. In the American Mercury, November 54, if you want to look it up, the article says that he visited Landsberg prison where the Germans were kept. See, he's not inside the prison. He visited the Landsberg prison, Landsberg prison, where the Germans were kept, and said a considerable number of the surviving Malmedy defendants had been released on parole during the last year. So it is possible that Kramer got out before 1955. Well, if he was interviewing the other people inside the camp, then obviously he was out. He wasn't a prisoner with them. I've checked all that we have on current and old German biographical directories and books on the Third Reich that included biographical material with no luck. See, I have books here of my own that have this information, but the great MOBAC computer service that's going to do your thinking for you has no information. But they have no luck. If the patron wants to do more serious research, they could or should use the Hoover Institute for War and Peace at Stanford University, but I have my doubts about finding information on the current whereabouts of Kramer. We'll close with this, and it's signed Carol Kuhn Bark, and this is information looking for Fritz Kramer. Now, was the Kramer who was interviewing for the U.S. Army, referred to in the Senate hearings, was he the Kramer from the American Army, or was he interviewing his buddies that still weren't out? And they said that they weren't mistreated. The excuse for getting all the Malmedy defendants out of prison was that they had been tortured and mistreated by the Allies, and this actually was not true, and there was no proof of their mistreatment. And Senator Joe McCarthy was the one instigating getting them out of prison. He was one of the people doing that. Now, I want to continue and finish off one segment that I did last week and repeat a little bit of it for you and add one more parcel or two to the item, and it has to do, it was triggered off by the articles in the paper last week on the special forces from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, will be in charge of the security of the U.S. Olympic, and the special forces from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, are part of the counterintelligence covert operations for murder, assassinations, and sabotage. And this last week, the newspaper said they would be in charge of security of the Olympics. And I reminded people that Squad 19 of the LAPD had planned to kill Richard Nixon and make Spiro Agnew the president of the United States, and he was put in by the Defense Department, the Greek military junta, and the European Nazis as links to those people. Now, last week I cited the Olympic Games security article, then the book Galen's Spy of the Century, how the Special Forces, the Green Berets, and the Special Operations Unit were set up by Hitler's generals, by Reinhard Gehlen, and President Eisenhower and Allen Dulles and Frank Wiesner of the CIA, and Dr. Franz Alfred Seeks was selected by Mr. Wiesner and Allen Dulles to head up the Special Forces, and Dr. Michael Achmeteli, Achmeteli, a Munich professor, a war criminal, an oil and mineral explorer with Herbert Hoover, who worked with the White Army, the Tsarist and Polish White Army, was to help Dr. Franz Seeks set up the Special Forces. Then, besides that, coming out of the book Galen, Spy of the Century, I referred to another book, The Belarus Secret by John Loftus, that just came out, how John J. McCloy, the German High Commissioner on the board of Chase Manhattan with Nelson Rockefeller and David Rockefeller, got Dr. Franz Seeks out of prison. He was supposed to be sentenced to death. He was released from the death sentence and recruited by Mr. Wiesner and by Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, and he was to help set up the special forces, and that was very important. So in the 50s, he was, instead of getting the death sentence, he was grabbed from the clutches of the Nuremberg trial and put into what was our OSS and became the CIA as a special agent. Now, in addition to those books, Galen's Spy of the Century about Sikhs, which was written in 1970, and The Belarus Secret, written in 1982 by Mr. Loftus, John Loftus, a good book that just came out. There's a third book about these incidences, and this book is called Skorzeny, Hitler's Commando by Glenn Infield. It's published by St. Martin's Press in New York. And in this book, he tells how the Odessa, the network of Nazis all over the world, was set up by Otto Skorzeny, and again, with the Belarusians and the war criminals from the Eastern Division, from Romania and so forth, with Skorzeny. And again, Otto von Bolschwing was part of this, and Adolf Eichmann, this operation. And in this book, Skorzeny, Hitler's Commandos, he goes at length in two areas that are of interest right now. One is the Irish connection of Mr. Otto Skorzeny, because I believe that John DeLorean was handpicked to continue when Skorzeny died in 1957, and DeLorean would get ready to go over Ireland, maybe to supervise or take over that world network in a way that Skorzeny had done and tap into it. And this book tells about the use of the Irish connections, and also about Dr. Seeks and Franz Seeks, and how Otto Skorzeny got him out of prison, not because John J. McCloy was so nice, but they blackmailed Winston Churchill. Skorzeny got access to the correspondence of Winston Churchill with Mussolini up through 1944, which would prove to the Western world and the Russians, they were accusing the West of making deals with Hitler and making deals with Mussolini. And Skorzeny got a hold of this correspondence. Now, in this book, The World in Skorzeny. It's a very good book by Enfield, and he has a new book out on the SS. This is called Skorzeny, Hitler's Commando. He tells about Skorzeny viewed Ireland as a basis of operation. He had Madrid and Argentina and South America. It was for the SS, Himmler's SS and the Gestapo. He wanted his SS members in Ireland. He viewed Ireland as an ideal spot for his operations. And Otto von Bolschwing's son, who's an attorney, has one office up north in the Bay Area and one in Ireland also. And we have many factories in Ireland. Skorzeny planned to help Hitler when Hitler would invade England during the war. He had a cadre of Irish fighters sympathetic to the German, and the Third Reich would be trained by SS in Germany and sent to Ireland. The pro-Nazi Irish underground movement would establish airfields for the Luftwaffe and sabotage British harbors and installations in Ireland. In 1957, Skorzeny decided to try again for Ireland. The war was over. He had gone under. He was out of prison. He'd go again for Ireland. He went there himself, and he posed as a man merely seeking a restful spot to live out his remaining days. He bought a home there. He purchased an estate, and then he brought many Nazis there with him. The Irish government was in a dilemma. He pretended he was going to raise sheep and horses to relax. He was still considered a dangerous man. He set up 70 estates. You know, DeLorean has a large estate in New Jersey, a large estate in San Diego, a townhouse in New York, and so forth. Skorzeny set up 70 estates occupied by Nazi associates in 1957. He had Prince Ernst Heinrich von Sachen, Sachsen, Alexander von Dornberg, Albert Schmidt. Dornberg was Himmler and Ribbentrop's staff member. He was Skorzeny's courier, his main member, and they would send couriers also over trips from Ireland to Amsterdam and to Dublin and back and forth. There was a German colony in Ireland well organized and ready for business by 1957, similar to what he set up in Spain. Skorzeny wanted it to be a beachhead for the SS organization as an operation against England, and of course our CIA, and I'll do more on this side of the tape, or maybe the other, if I don't have time on this side of the broadcast, of the information of the CIA and the Irish, the IRA, and the funding and the weapons going there for 25 years, just one little tap on the wrist and an arrest where they got off just this last week. But the United States had the CIA right from the end of World War II, the OSS and the CIA working with Skorzeny, pecking away against Great Britain. Now, one thing Skorzeny wanted was a secure base in Ireland, and one of the people that he fought against was Winston Churchill, because Churchill insisted that the Nazis accept a conditional surrender, and at the end of the war, Allen Dulles wanted to make a deal with the Nazis that would be easier on them than that. So Skorzeny used his contacts to blackmail Winston Churchill. He used a member of the SS by the name of Fritz Knochlin, Knochlin. He wanted him released, and Churchill refused to release him, and he was going to help set up the Odessa. He had the organizational headwork. And Knochlin had been sentenced to death, but Churchill would not administer what Skorzeny wanted in releasing this person. So Skorzeny waited one more year till Churchill was running for election in Great Britain. He wanted to be reelected there, and so then is the time he had a scheme, according to this book by Enfield. Skorzeny had a scheme. He had in his possession the letters of Winston Churchill that were written to Mussolini from 1927 to 1944. Remember the Battle of the Bulges in December 44, and Winston Churchill is praising Mussolini for what he did for his fight against communism. And in the correspondence got in the hands of Skorzeny in April 1945, 2 weeks before the war was over. Mussolini was leaving Milan. He was leaving with his mistress. Skorzeny got the mistress to be his agent. He had rescued Mussolini in 1943, and Mussolini trusted him, and he held in his briefcase, Mussolini did, the letters of the correspondence with Winston Churchill. So all Skorzeny had to do was to set up a mistress with Mussolini and get access to this satchel that had the correspondence of Winston Churchill from Great Britain to Mussolini while the war was going on. I talk about this connivery every week, and this is one more example. Few days after this satchel was obtained of the letters, 3 days later, Mussolini and his mistress were executed. The letters of Churchill disappeared. Otto Skorzeny got them back from the person who got them from the mistress, and they were given to him. When the elections approached in 1951, he met Winston Churchill in Venice. He produced the letters, and according to this account of the man who accompanied Skorzeny, his name was Paul Forster, Forster, they went over the wartime items and discussed them, and Winston Churchill, when he was named Prime Minister, did something he swore he would never do. He gave orders to the American High Commissioner, and that was John J. McCloy from Chase Manhattan Bank, and later to be on the Warren Commission, to open the prison doors and release Nazi prisoners, such as Gottlieb Berger, Berger, the SS general who was sentenced to 25 years in prison and served 2, Hans Lammers, Lammers, Hitler's chief Reich Chancellery. He's a former chief of the Chancellery. And he got Paul Korner out, who ran the Hermann Goering Works. And he got Franz Alfred Seeks, who was Adolf Eichmann's superior. Now, Otto von Bolschwing allegedly was over Eichmann in pecking order of the hierarchy of Germany, Nazi Germany, and from the Netherlands and from Romania, and he took on the Gehlen operation in the United States. Otto von Bolschwing was above Eichmann, and Dr. Seeks also was a part of the Eichmann operation. So Seeks got out because Otto Skorzeny had blackmailed Winston Churchill, and Frank Wiesner of the CIA, and Allen Dulles, Nelson Rockefeller, and Richard Nixon wanted him to begin setting up those special forces that are so important to counterintelligence. Another man, Edmund Wiesemeyer, Veesenmayer, SS Command of Skorzeny, and there's a list of top Nazis, Mr. Kurt Meyer, Meyer, a general in the Waffen SS who was tried for the massacre of Canadian prisoners of war. Churchill didn't want him out, but he let them out, and the day they were out, they said, "We enter the front door, we're not messengers or servants, and we're going to set up the Federal Republic in the state of Germany." They were released and went immediately to German industry, German military. Otto Skorzeny's goal, according to Mr. Infield, was to have meetings again, and in 1957, they began all over to retrench. All of them were out. They were out because Frank Wiesner of the CIA wanted it, because Reinhard Gehlen wanted it, because Skorzeny blackmailed Winston Churchill, and they have important positions today. One of the people that began organizing with them is Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich, Skorzeny, Fritz Kramer, and Piper all worked together in the Battle of the Bulge, worked with Adolf Hitler and the SS and so forth. And this book goes into the High Commissioner, John McCloy, so that many of the books that I have in my library, or you can get at your library or buy them, go into the tangled web of how important it was to get former Nazis out so that we could begin what is known as the Special Forces for Counterintelligence. And finally, on that note, I just want to review for you, some of you don't remember this, but I had on broadcast 2 years ago in 1980, July 11th, 1980, a correspondence with James Frankenberry from Atlanta Federal Prison in Georgia. He sent me his picture, and he sent me an outline of the Special Forces. He said, and it had to do with the John Kennedy assassination. He said, I was enlisted in the Army March 18th, 1962. After basic training in infantry at Fort Ord, California, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia for jump school. And September 28th, I was assigned to Fort Bragg. During that time, the officers told him at a small meeting that they were to be flown into Riga, Latvia, USSR, and that's where von Bolschwing was organizing people to fly in to help overthrow the Soviet Union. And they were supposed to assassinate a person. This is what they were told. But then later they were told that instead of the Riga operation, and to kill some colonel in the Soviet army who was infiltrating the CIA, they were actually going to practice shooting in February 1963 on an assignment in the United States. The target would be Major General Edwin Walker. Later they blamed Lee Harvey Oswald for trying to shoot General Walker. to prove that he had this propensity for violence, although he had never shot anyone or even was seen with a gun before. And then he said he was taken off the assignment and somebody else had the job. But as late as 1969, he learned about the story of Oswald and Walker in the various books that were coming out. He didn't have the Warren Commission hearings. And he realized that the 5 people that he trained with, that 5 trainees were selected, and they had a stalking procedure and a sniper weapon that they were familiar with, and they trained at Camp David, and they were to assassinate a foreign dignitary, which after Watergate they realized was the John Kennedy assassination. Another team was chosen. His team wasn't chosen, but they had a person, a body on a track, similar to the movie that was made, the Mark Lane book, the executive movie. Is not a book. Well, he did a book too, The Executive Action. But he said this whole script was done before the movie came out, and he had written to Irving Wallace about it. Wallace didn't pay any attention. Bragg, North Carolina is the place to watch, and that's where Hitler's Nazi generals went to begin training special forces, and those are the people that will be in L.A. at the time of the Olympics. I'm going to turn this tape over now. It's the end of the first half hour. This is Mae Brussell and KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. Yes, always make resolutions, but they don't last too long. I don't know about you. I do want to share with you some information I got from Pete Carey, a few pages from the Freedom of Information Act. This is on Otto von Bolschwing. He just got these from the Air Force. Among other things, Otto von Bolschwing from 1965 to 1967. And this was a time when the Nazis were being released by John J. McCloy, the High Commissioner. Von Bolschwing was working for the Cabot Corporation out of Boston, Massachusetts. He worked under the Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, as he did during the work during World War II in Amsterdam and with the Iron Guard. And he was located then with that corporation TCI up in Sacramento. During 1955 to 1969, it mentions that he was in Austria, Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, Bermuda, Bahamas, Spain, Portugal, Gibraltar, Holland, Belgium, Great Britain, Luxembourg, West Germany, West Berlin, Italy, and Switzerland. A lot of the Gehlen Nazi Odessa networks in those cities for sure. There are references for his being in this country. They listed one law office, Mr. Sigerson, Sigerson, General Counsel and Secretary of Carter and Wallace Incorporated. I looked that up in Who's Who, and then 4 other references for being in this country. I looked up into 5 different years, 5 different volumes of Who's Who, and can't find anybody that signed for him. Under Freedom of Information, Mr. Otto von Bolschwing says that he owned a coal mine in Katowice area of Poland, Katowice. The current pope came from Waterwice. Are they close? Yes, they're about 20 miles away from Auschwitz. If you take the shape of an L, Katowice is 20 miles north of Auschwitz, and Otto von Bolschwing owned a coal mine there in 1932-33. He may own it still for all we know. He just passed away, but his son may own it. And the current pope who worked for I.G. Farben and worked at Auschwitz at the time that Otto von Bolschwing was working for these pharmaceutical concerns and so forth and had the coal mine in Poland. The current pope was at Waterwice Military School, which is 20 miles east of Auschwitz. He was at military school. His father was a military officer in Poland, and then he went to work at Auschwitz during the war. So there was a 20 miles south of Auschwitz or 20 miles east from Katowice. The 2 Polish cities are separated. And one current pope, the one from Poland, came from one town very close by to where Otto von Bolschwing had a coal mine in this time period. In 1933, von Bolschwing left Germany the year that Hitler was elected, and he was active in the Nazi Party. He left for Bulgaria and worked for W. Bormann and Company. Now, he belongs to part of the Bormann operation in the Odessa after the war. Was this a father, a brother, an uncle, or a coincidence? It's W. Bormann and Company, and the offices were Sofia, Bulgaria. The investigator for the assassination attempt on the Pope resigned today. He said they're tying his hands. They're trying to squeeze a commie plot out of this thing. He wants to go to Bulgaria and speak to the people. The Italian government won't let him. But this particular Otto von Bolschwing set up an office for the Nazis in Sofia, Bulgaria, and Mr. Agca, who shot the Pope, worked with the Nazis in Frankfurt and in Turkey and with the Grey Wolves, and had a Nazi operation. So to say that these men, 3 or 4 men, came from Bulgaria doesn't mean they weren't Nazis. Reinhard Gehlen had offices in Bulgaria, and Otto von Bolschwing was in Bulgaria. He also worked for the Iraq Petrol Company, and he worked for a German industrial firm that financed the trade by a corporation called Havara, Havara, described as German Jewish capital transfer in the form of exports. He was part of the operation to take Jewish property and homes and sell it, not to give the money to the Jews, but sell it and give it to the government, such as the Netherlands and Germany, and put the capital in the Middle East, sending it there. Otto von Bolschwing was part of that. He worked for the Cabot Corporation in the Netherlands from 1965 to 1967, when these top Nazis, the last of the gang that were to get out, were being released. He was in Netherlands and France. In this list of countries that he traveled to, he said, "My son traveled to Korea as a result of being in the United States military." His son is the fellow who has the law office in San Francisco and one in Ireland, and he went to Korea and Argentina and Brazil and Peru and so forth. The family traveled all over the world. Otto von Bolschwing in 1957 spent 2 weeks in Europe. Now, 1957 was the year that Wiesner and John J. McCloy, on the coaxing and gifts of Winston Churchill, who had been blackmailed to release Mr. Seeks and others, he went to Europe, and he went under the cover of Warner Lambert Pharmaceutical Company from New Jersey. His trip was paid by ex-Governor Alfred E. Driscoll, who was president of Warner Lambert, from his personal funds, and that's the man who nominated Richard Nixon to be vice president. And, of course, Nixon, its history, lost to John Kennedy, but the same Nazi entourage that was behind Richard Nixon putting in his operation were working with international Nazis long before Richard Nixon, not long before he ran against the president, but starting his vice presidency. He was nominated by Driscoll from New Jersey, and Driscoll's the person who, from his personal bank, was sending Otto von Bolschwing to Europe at the exact time that the people that Richard Nixon and Wiesner and Rockefeller wanted out of the German prisoners, these war criminals, at the same time and year that they were being sprung loose in August of 1957, people that should have died at Nuremberg. This man was working with the funds of the person who was to nominate Richard Nixon as the vice president under Eisenhower. If I'm spending a great deal of time going slow on this, I think I want to make the point very clear that in 1957, according to these sources, through blackmail and otherwise at Winston Churchill and the American government, the collusion of John J. McCloy, the High Commissioner of Germany, chairman of Chase Manhattan, top Nazis were released that were to form our special forces that were to do counterintelligence operations all over the world. And this same year, Otto von Bolschwing, who's paid by the man who nominated Nixon as the vice president, out of his purse under the pharmaceutical concern of Warner Lambert, is sending Reinhard Gehlen's agent, who was Eichmann's superior, named Otto von Bolschwing, working in California with the corporation TCI. He's soon to become the vice president of it. He sent to Europe to go to these various countries. He was on a business trip in Argentina. He traveled all over the world. In these documents on Otto von Bolschwing, he says, in June of 1969, for 3.5 weeks, I visited Wuppertal, W-P-P-E-R-T-A-L, and Munich and Frankfurt in West Germany for the Trans-International Computer Investment Corporation as a consultant. Now, that corporation in June 1969, as I said before, was being set up by Mr. Simon Rifkin and a group of lawyers and persons high up in the military intelligence out of office in Sunnyvale, California, Sacramento, Washington, and Beverly Hills, California. And then Rifkin becomes the attorney for Chris Kraft, and they buy a part of 20th Century Fox and immediately put Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford on the board. The tangled web of these people recurs over and over and again, and if I repeat their names, it's on purpose so that they become almost household words for you. As the president, vice president of TCI in April of 1970, as the head of the corporation. Now, see, the Rifkin and those attorneys, and the attorney for the Sterling Bank Group, the one that set up Michael Sandona's connections with Milan, Italy, and the Vatican. As the attorney now, the TCI has set up the offices. He visits Frankfurt, he visits Munich, Basel, Zurich, Switzerland. He travels all over Europe and so forth. And this is about his work as elected president of TCI, my present employment. In 1970, he was president of that corporation, TCI, that gave them the ability to travel. There's a book called Causes and Conflicts by George Martin. It's about the history of the Bar Association in New York City, and they refer to a law firm of Carter, Ledard, and Milburn, Ledyard, Ledyard it is, and Milburn. And this was a very conservative Republican office that Mr. Wiesner joined in Manhattan after he got out of law school in Virginia, and Wiesner became the head of the CIA. And the books on law offices have very little about the individuals that formed the office, but Mr. Wiesner belonged to this conservative office and then went right to Germany to recruit these Nazis. He came out of that office, and as I say, there isn't too much in the books I have on the office, but it's an important one to keep looking up, and I'll do more on it. Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn out of Manhattan, because from there they pushed Mr. Wiesner to release the Nazis in Europe, and Mr. Driscoll, the Republican Party, and Eisenhower and Tom Dewey and Richard Nixon then incorporated the Nazis into the Republican Party as part of their policy and for maintaining the profits in countries overseas with military dictatorships. Now, reviewing the cast of characters I've been talking about in regards to the murder of John Kennedy, to keep going back to that, de Mohrenschildt was under pay of Nelson Rockefeller, had blank checks, and was close to Nelson Rockefeller, the same person who helped bring in the Belarusian Nazis. He was Lee Harvey Oswald's closest contact and associate when he returned from the Soviet Union. He and his wife got Oswald housing, got them jobs, and arranged their location, his location in the Texas School Book Depository, and introduced Oswald to Ruth and Michael Paine. Michael Paine worked for Mr. Walter Dornberger, the Nazi who was supposed to have been hung at Nuremberg also and got out with Werner von Braun. Now, Allen Dulles set up the meeting of Mr. Franz Siegs, the Special Forces. He was on the Warren Commission to investigate the conspiracy part of the murder of John Kennedy, and of course excluded any links of the Nazis to the murder of the president. Richard Nixon, who worked with Mr. Wiesner and Rockefeller, who lost to John Kennedy in 1960, was in charge of the Bay of Pigs. He worked with Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, E. Howard Hunt, and he worked with the Nazis who were involved in setting up the framework and had a role in the murder of John Kennedy. He was the paymaster, the supervisor of the Bay of Pigs, and then the recipient of the dead Kennedys, not the rock group, but after the two Kennedys were dead, he got his throne in the White House. John J. McCloy was the High Commissioner of Germany. He was on the Warren Commission. He was in charge of the Soviet Union part of the Lee Harvey Oswald connections. Marina Oswald was a white Russian brought here by the International Rescue Committee, a CIA organization. John J. McCloy and Allen Dulles were on the Warren Commission. Leon Jaworski, who I want to do more about next week, was an attorney for the Judge Advocate's Office of the Army, Dachau trials, the Nuremberg trials, the Warren Commission. He was with Jack Ruby and Gerald Ford when Ruby wasn't allowed to tell them in security how the assassinations took place. And again, Mr. James Frankenberry wrote to me a long time ago, 8 years ago, on the Special Forces and the use of the group from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in practicing for the shooting of General Walker and the murder of John Kennedy. And Clay Shaw worked in the OSS. He worked with Reinhard Gehlen and had CIA headquarters in the International Trade Mart in New Orleans and was directly linked to Oswald's doubles in New Orleans. I don't believe his meetings were with Oswald, but were with Oswald's doubles. And the Dallas-Fort Worth area, New Orleans, and Mexico, and Miami were the headquarters of the Reinhard Gehlen agents, the Lee and Marina Oswald contacts. So through the years before John Loftus wrote his book, before Mr. Enfield wrote his book on the SS, before the Gehlen book came out by Cookeridge, I was identifying segments of people on the Warren Commission or associates of Lee Harvey Oswald with direct links to the Nazi Gehlen operation, and every week their names come out in some form in the news. Now, lastly, I'm going to skip now away from that area to the Nugan Bank, which will incorporate the whole ball of wax as you see it unfold. The ball of wax, by definition, being the various conspiracies, the assassinations, the banks collapsing, the intrigue that's been going on since World War II that I've studied so closely. More than the time period from World War I to World War II is interesting, but the deals from, say, 1943 to the present. Last week on the broadcast, I quoted the London Observer, the article by Michael Davey on what was happening in Australia and how the same thing that's happening to Australia is happening in the United States, where he said the scandals there are bigger than anyone thought. And to repeat it, he said they linked the murders, the suicides, the disappearance of Royal Commission witnesses, the massive shred of documents, the shadow of the CIA, expanding heroin trade, and financial scandals. That was in the London Observer. This past week, there were other very good articles. I can't quote them all, but there's one about Australia and the CIA, a different article than the one I mentioned last week. That was a stepping stone to another series, and this one was by James A. Nathan, is in the Sunday San Francisco Examiner and Chronicle, and repeated in another journal called Foreign Policy of 1982, the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, the writers from the University of Delaware, if you want to write for that, or I'll copy the article for you. James Nathan, a professor of political science at the University of Delaware. He has an article, Down and Dirty Down Under, how the CIA toppled the Australian government of 1975. Now, Christopher Boyce said that the CIA toppled and destabilized the government. Mr. Monahan said that's ridiculous, they never did, but now it seems, according to this account, this isn't the one I read from the London Observer, there are deaths, drugs, forgery, financial hanky-panky, that Australians don't believe what is happening as the official stories go, and they are beginning to put it together. Now, we have the same thing in this country, but once people get in their minds that these are all interconnected and linked and that the parties have names, then we're home free. This article is the first one that I have seen that asks for a congressional investigation into the Nugan story. He concludes by saying, perhaps given the CIA's reticence in making painful disclosures in the past, the matter ought to be taken up by Congress. And this goes into Frank Nugan's murder and Michael Hand's disappearance, how the CIA was involved, and the itinerary of William Colby of the CIA that was in the pocket of Mr. Frank Nugan, who was murdered in 1980. This article goes into detail on the corruption of the government, how the United States government and the CIA leaked evidence and information to sneak out the existing government there, and that we were up to hanky-panky at the time of the elections in Australia. We forced one government to be put out of office because they were criticizing United States policy, the bombings in Cambodia and Hanoi. And the Whitlam government, WHITLAM, was not trusted by the CIA because they didn't like the secret that weren't secret bombings that Henry Kissinger, the protege of Fritz Kramer, was doing on his own by decimating and bombing over in Southeast Asia. Now, this article goes into great detail how Whitlam was dismissed and how a man by the name of Mr. Kerr, Kerr, was put into more power and a salary raise, and how he worked for the Australian government. He was an Australian-born lawyer during World War II. He was on intelligence missions. He worked with the OSS, that's Mr. Donovan and Mr. Allen Dulles, and then he worked for the CIA. He founded the Asian Foundation branch, Law Asia, that was a CIA conduit, and he started to get more money and higher salary as the government, Whitlam, was pushed out and Fraser came in. Then this article goes into the role of the CIA in the Nugan Bank and in the various dirty tricks played against the Whitlam government. Then it takes on Task Force 157 that was active in overthrowing the government with the use of Bernie Houghton, a Nugan official. He's in Saudi Arabia. It goes into naval research, the 100 properties that the CIA had running out of Task Force 157 with Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley, and Bobby Inman, who became deputy director of the CIA, recently stepped down. He was National Security Advisor. Now they go into the plans to overthrow the government in Chile that killed Salvador Allende, and the merchant bankers that involved themselves with the Nugan Bank that was spread into 22 different countries. We hear about Thailand and Laos and Hong Kong, but they worked with the Laotian poppy dealers. They laundered money from the poppy growers, and they've been involved with heroin traffic around the world. This article mentions the very important years of the Nugan story, which were 1976 to 1977. Now, George Bush was director of the CIA from January 76 to February 77. There is dope dealing and coming out. There are countless murders. There is destabilization of countries and missing millions and billions. George Bush's name, except in a few articles, has been missing. One article did have George Bush's picture. I think we should get rid of our vice president. He was director of the CIA, but he not only directed it, it's different than saying Mr. Andropov over in the Soviet Union was head of the KGB and now he's president. We don't know that he's involved in dealing in the Soviet Union, of drugging his people, of selling heroin in Moscow, of bringing in cocaine and heroin. I don't know what Andropov does or doesn't do, but I'll bet you that if he were drug dealing in the Soviet Union, he wouldn't be the president of the Soviet Union. And yet this man could easily be the president at any moment, and he's named in these various scandals at the years that were so important in overthrowing that government, in years of their dope dealing, and now all the murders. Now, this article suggesting that Congress open these matters up just came out this last week, long overdue, December 19th, 1982. And I got out the sheets of my broadcast October 26, 1980. That's 2 years and 2 months ago, when a listener up in Canada, a world watcher, sent me a clipping from the London Times. It was August 31st, 1980. The bank, the CIA, heroin and murder, 12 missing or dead. And this had to do with the Nugan Bank. That's the first I heard of it when I got the article from a person living in Canada who got it from London. And I put it on the air immediately in October. Frank Nugan was murdered in January of 1980, and the people in the United States didn't have an inkling of what this meant until 12 people had been missing or dead, and the London Times picked it up. Then the following week, I did a broadcast on the Nugan Bank, and I cited the links to the John Kennedy assassination. And the reason I bring this up is that the very people involved with the Pine Ridge group, the CIA in Australia, that are involved with Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley, named in this group, are the people going back to the murder of John Kennedy. So the news today in the London Times, the London Observer, in the Wall Street Journal on these scandals, if they were opened up properly, would lead you to the very people who arranged to bring the Young Americans for Freedom, the Munich, Germany Nazis, to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, to Robert Morris's home. He was the attorney for the House Internal Subcommittee and worked with Senator Joe McCarthy. He's the president of a bank in Texas, not a bank, a university now at the present time. But in 1978, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was doing their work, I was pointing out that John Paisley, who was murdered, worked with Lee Harvey Oswald while he was in Navy intelligence in the Soviet Union. And in 1980, the stories came out about John Paisley working with the Nugan group in Australia. Not to confuse you too much, I could cite a few dates that I had just 2 years ago. November 1980, one was broadcast 465, the Washington Post story and the Globe story on the Nugan Bank. In September 15, 1978, CIA agent John Hart testified before the House Select Committee on the assassination of John Kennedy on the conditions that he can't mention the name or activities of Lee Harvey Oswald. The purpose of the investigation of John Kennedy was to go into people like Oswald, but he couldn't talk about Oswald. 1 week later, September 23rd, just a week later, a little less than 2 weeks, in 1978, John Paisley was murdered. He worked under John Hart, and Mrs. Paisley, Marianne Paisley, worked with Mr. Hart, and his wife also. Mrs. Hart was a CIA agent, the four of them. John Paisley was murdered. The attorney for his widow, Marianne Paisley, was the same Bernard Fensterwald of the Committee to investigate assassinations. He was James McCord's attorney at the time of Watergate. He's the attorney for the defendants of Task Force 157 that they're not getting enough payoff at the present time. John Paisley worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet operations. November 18, 1978, 2 months after Paisley was murdered, was the time of the Jonestown murders that involved gun running and narcotics. And 2 days later, January 25th, 2 months after Jonestown, Rockefeller was murdered with a Venezuelan Guyana links to Nelson Rockefeller's operations in Venezuela. And 2 days later, Frank Nugan was murdered, linked to the United States Navy heroin in the CIA. From September 1978, then up to Frank Nugan's murder in 1980. Pieces of this puzzle and the Nugan Hand Bank were about to be opened up, and they were quieted with Frank Nugan's murder, and Michael Hand disappeared, and then the 12 deaths, and then 7-8 months later, the London Times ran a story to expose these people. Well, they ran it in 1980, but it's in the news every day, and as I say, if properly investigated, you'd find that Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, and these various characters do, in fact, go back to the Munich operations of people that were brought from Munich, Germany, to the Dallas-Fort Worth area that played some of them an individual minor role, but all played a role in the murder of John Kennedy. Now I'm going on to a few single news items that are important because there's so many. I don't want to lose them. There's just not enough time during the week to hit them all. Jack Anderson had a story this week, December 21st, 1982, more on Edwin Wilson. This is Edwin Wilson meeting in Geneva with 3 anti-Castro Cuban CIA agents, and how he was close to these people. And in Washington, D.C., Edwin Wilson warned the agents that he was working with, don't be in a certain area tomorrow or today. That he told the House Intelligence Committee, Mr. Wagner, Peter Wagner, this is an alias, said that he was told not to go to a certain area September 21st, 1976 by Edwin Wilson, that he had to go. He was working on a divorce case, and he was 2 blocks away from there, and in a car at Sheridan Circle. This is where Orlando Letelier, the Cuban exile leader, was living, and Miss Moffat and the 2 of them were blown up in the car. And Jack Anderson is saying that he printed several years ago that Edwin Wilson had a role in the murder of Orlando Letelier, and that he knew in advance, and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post knew that Wilson knew in advance, and that they were working for the CIA. And again, Orlando Letelier murder was done at the time that George Bush was director of the CIA, September 21st, 1976, in Washington, D.C. His agent, Edwin Wilson, and the Cuban exiles that Theodore Shackley and Wilson worked with and for, blew up a man from Chile and worked with Michael Townley of the CIA, who worked with the DINA in Australia. And George Bush, our present director, was part of ordering that assassination, because as the CIA director, he would have to give approval. I handed out pamphlets, you remember, at the Republican convention here last year, with the dates of George Bush as director of the CIA and the murders that took place and the Nugan Hand heroin drug traffic. And this man would like to be, and possibly will be, your next president of the United States. Now, this last week, it was December 23rd, 1982, a primary witness to one of these big drug arrests that William French Smith says is going to happen in Miami was murdered, and many of you know the name, Ricardo Monkey Morales, Morales. He's Navarrete. He uses his name Navarette. He's referred to as a real-life James Bond. He worked 20 years with the CIA. He worked with the Belgian Congo, the FBI. He was part of the Miami Police Department's Operation TikTok on drug traffic in the Miami area. He was shot in the head last week and died. He was brain dead, just as Roberta Calvi died when they were investigating the Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank. And Kevin McCullough was murdered just at the time that Edwin Wilson was going to trial on his 3 different charges in different cities. Well, Mr. Morales admitted his responsibility a while back in blowing up an airplane Cuban airline in 1976 was 73 people abroad working for Chile and for the CIA. He was given immunity working for the Drug Enforcement Agency. He was shot in the head last week and died in Miami, Florida. Another big story in the news that I haven't been able to cover is the DeLorean links with the IRA. Maybe I'll have to do that next week because there's so much material on DeLorean and the IRA. He's been accused of ties with it. He bragged on the tapes that he funded his cocaine distribution with money from the IRA. The IRA is calling him a common criminal. He bragged about his abilities to work for the IRA, and of course he has strong links to the Catholic Church and the Vatican, and there's reason to believe that the tapes that he said and made, the many hours of tapes, are true. New York Magazine has an article, The Patriot Game by Shanna Alexander, on the IRA, and I would like to analyze that with you and how these men got acquitted at the trial this last week. There were some articles sent to me from New York on how the gun runners who worked for the CIA for 20 years, admitted working 25 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, were shipping constantly weapons to Ireland for their explosives for the constant war against the British. I will catch up on that and the Leon Jaworski story next week, I promise. One final thing before we go off the air. I mentioned a landmark case up here in San Mateo over the custody of Reva Fishman, the 11-year-old girl whose mother is a good mother, but she's a pro-Maoist, an atheist, a communist. The father works for Lockheed. Ted Fishman lost the case. The judge gave the custody back to the mother, even though she is a communist. The U.S. government and the San Mateo County Court Commissioner James Browning lost the case. The judge disagreed with them. The child can go to the mother. If the father wants to get custody by going to Chicago, he can. But the California judge gave the mother the right, with the political philosophy she has, to have her daughter. And that is a great landmark case, so there are victories. Our time is running out. I'll have to continue on DeLorean, the IRA, Leon Jaworski, and 200 great stories. I hope we get caught up on these, but this is all the time we have now. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM. I'll be back with you next week.